Some stories from New England stay quiet longer than they should. This is one of them. Drive far enough north in New Hampshire and the road starts to feel like a decision. US Route 3 thins out. The lakes hold still. Canada stops being a shape on a map and becomes the next thing you could walk into if you simply kept going. Most people who pass through Pittsburg come for moose, snow, quiet water. They might notice a historical marker on the village green. They might not stop. If they do, the words sound almost impossible. This place once had its own country. Not a nickname, not a festival, not a joke on a gift shop mug. A written constitution, elected officers, courts, taxes, a name, the Republic of Indian Stream. A few hundred people lived inside it, and then, for most of New England, it vanished so completely that you could grow up an hour from the Connecticut River and never hear that the river's own headwaters once sat inside a nation that was never supposed to exist. So the question is not whether the story sounds strange. The question is simpler and harder. How did ordinary people end up needing a country of their own in the middle of New England? And why did the rest of us forget them? Stay with the impossibility for a moment. This was not the Republic of Texas. It was not a continental revolution. It was a northern settlement at the head of the Connecticut. Rough country, river country, border country, with a population you could almost seat in a large meeting house. That smallness is not a reason to dismiss it. It is the reason the story cuts deeper. Because if only a few hundred people could write a constitution, hold assemblies, collect taxes, and try to keep order while two empires argued over their heads, this was not a costume. It was a government born under pressure. One of the men who helped build that pressure cooker legality was Luther Parker, a New Hampshire-born settler who arrived in 1827 with a schoolteacher's mind and a frontiersman's problem. How do you live under law when the map refuses to say whose law applies? Parker would sit on the committee that drafted the Constitution. He would serve as justice of the peace for the Republic. But before you understand what they built, you have to understand the vice they were living in. Because the popular version of this story, lonely woodsmen inventing a country for fun, is wrong. They did not invent a country because no one claimed them. They invented a country because too many people did. Imagine living where a single road can carry two kinds of authority on the same afternoon. From one direction comes New Hampshire process, sheriffs, debt writs, the assumption that Coos County law reaches this far north. From the other comes British Lower Canada, and a justice of the peace across the line in Hereford named Alexander Ray, pressing the claim that this ground belongs to the king. Around 1831, the pressure tightens in ways that are easy to miss if you only look for taxes. United States officers collect duties on goods leaving Indian Stream, as if the settlement is foreign enough to charge and close enough to control. Canadian authorities are reported to demand military service from some of the inhabitants, as if those same people are British subjects when it suits the empire. New Hampshire keeps sending its own legal force into the same farms and clearings. So the problem is not wilderness. The problem is a kind of legal weather system. Two flags, two processes, one body that can be seized by either. If you have ever lived anywhere that felt ignored by distant power, invert that feeling. These people were not ignored. They were overclaimed. Once you see that, a larger question appears. How does a border get so broken that ordinary families have to invent a country just to survive the paperwork? To answer that, you do not start in the North Woods. You start in 1783 in the peace that ends the American Revolution. The Treaty of Paris is supposed to settle the line between the new United States and British North America. On paper, it does. In one crucial place, it does not. The boundary is described as running to the northwesternmost head of the Connecticut River. It sounds precise. It is not. Because at the true head of that river system, water splits into possibilities. Hall Stream, Indian Stream, Perry Stream, the chain of Connecticut lakes. Which of those is the northwesternmost head? The United States argument tends toward the western line, Hall's Stream, roughly the border you can still trace today. The British argument can favor interpretations that pull more of the headwaters, including the lakes, into their side. One phrase, several possible maps. And between those maps, a wedge of land large enough to hold a community and ambiguous enough that neither empire finishes the job for decades. For roughly 60 years after the Revolution's peace, the people who settle that wedge live inside the gap between language and landscape. That is the first transformation of this story. Indian Stream is not a quirky New Hampshire footnote. It is unfinished American Revolution, still running quietly in the woods at the top of New England. People do not wait for diplomats to finish a sentence. They come anyway. Hunters first, then settlers, land companies, deeds layered on deeds. In 1796, a deed from Chief Philip of the St. Francis Abenaki, not the Metacomet of King Philip's War, a different man in a different century, helps open a paper path for European title in the district. Later retellings sometimes blur those names. History should not. What follows is the ordinary machinery of frontier property. Pitches, proprietors' meetings, overlapping claims, families from the Connecticut Valley towns moving north along the only highway that never needed building, the river. By the late 1820s, Indian Stream is a living settlement with tax inventories and local meetings. The United States Census of 1830 does not quite know what to call it. Indian Stream Territory, so called. Even the federal government can hear the shrug in its own paperwork. Then international arbitration hardens the air. An award associated with the King of the Netherlands favors Britain on key boundary points. The United States rejects it. Canadian pressure increases. Ray's hand grows heavier. American duties bite. On March 5, 1832, the inhabitants meet and begin to move from informal order towards something more permanent. Not because they want a flag for its own sake, because the alternative is permanent uncertainty. And uncertainty in a world of warrants is not abstract. It is who knocks on your door. June 11th, 1832. The meeting does what New England meetings have always done when the problem is too large for one man's temper. It appoints a committee. David Mitchell, Luther Parker, Phineas Willard, Herman Batchelder, Nathan Judd. Their charge is not to found an eternal empire. It is to draft a constitution and laws for order and peace until the boundary line is established between Lower Canada and the United States. July 9, 1832. The legal voters assemble, the committee reports, and the Constitution of Indian Stream is adopted. If you want the single most important idea in this entire story, it is not that they declared independence, it is how they declared it. They formed themselves into a body politic by the name of Indian Stream. They claim the powers of a free, sovereign, and independent state for their own internal government, until such time as they can ascertain to what government they properly belong. This is not a fantasia forever. This is emergency legality with an expiration clause written into the founding. They build a Bill of Rights, branches of government, a Supreme Council, a justice of the peace, an assembly of voters, mechanisms for tax and debt, provisions for militia. For 3 years, in a settlement of only a few hundred souls, it works well enough to leave records, assemblies, inventories, enactments, the texture of a real polity. Luther Parker serves as justice of the peace. The republic is small, it is temporary on purpose, and that is what makes it serious. Because these people are not playing nation. They are trying to remain human under 2 sets of paper that will not agree. Which forces the next question, the one the amused version of this history never asks carefully enough. If they only wanted clarity, why does the story end in force and then in blood? By 1835, the experiment is no longer only local. Factions form inside Indian Stream, some leaning toward New Hampshire authority, some toward British protection, all living on the same roads. New Hampshire decides the blank space has lasted long enough. Governor William Badger and the legislature assert state authority. The executive officers of Coos County are to be backed. Militia readiness gathers near the settlement. Captain James Mooney's company of the 24th Regiment, about 50 men, staged out of the Stewartstown country. This is not a rumor of force. It is force, waiting. In the spring and summer, process-serving conflicts escalate. The Indian Stream Assembly even passes acts against the unlawful serving of outside process, a government trying to defend the legal space it created. Then comes the week that ends the country without the battle you might expect. August 4th, 1835. The Coos County Sheriff meets a portion of the assembly, a few dozen men, and delivers the reality of the situation. New Hampshire is prepared to occupy. Most of those present capitulate. August 5th. Leaders write to a British official in Sherbrooke. The substance is devastating in its practicality. Protection from Britain has not come in time. They have agreed to annexation by New Hampshire, the Republic of Indian Stream, as an independent operating government ends. Not in a climactic battlefield charge, in an ultimatum, a majority vote under threat, and a letter that admits the calendar has run out. Richard I. Blanchard, one of the New Hampshire-leaning men of the settlement, accepts service as a Coos County deputy. Yesterday's streamer becomes today's instrument of the state that has just absorbed his country. If the story stopped here, it would already be enough to rearrange what you thought having your own country meant. But history is not tidy, because the government can die in August and the border can still detonate in October. Early October 1835. Alexander Ray is still active. He summons meetings at schoolhouses in the settlement, carrying communications from Lower Canada, assurances of protection against New Hampshire encroachments, the old claim wearing a softer face now that annexation has already begun. Around the same time, a different kind of paper enters the story, a private debt. John H. Tyler, an Indian Stream resident, not a president, not a symbol, a man who owes money, is arrested on a writ in favor of William Buckminster, a Vermont creditor. Deputy William M. Smith comes in with identification help from Milton Harvey and Richard I. Blanchard. Tyler refuses to show property for attachment. On the road, neighbors rescue him. A reward is advertised for his delivery to the jail in Lancaster. That could have remained a local humiliation. It does not. Tyler, in the telling preserved through the official investigations, falsely places the location of his arrest in Drayton, Lower Canada, shifting a New Hampshire process into an alleged British territorial violation. Ray issues a warrant in the name of the King for Blanchard's arrest. October 22nd. Blanchard is taken from his house early in the morning by a small party that includes Tyler himself, one gun among the captors, a legal abduction wearing the costume of imperial process. Blanchard's young son runs the river road, raising the alarm. At the Parker place, later memory preserves a doorway moment. Blanchard being carried toward Canada, the settlement waking into crisis. Luther Parker and others ride to Rouse, Clarksville, Stewartstown, Colebrook. Armed men gather. A rescue party intercepts Blanchard's captors near the Hereford Canaan country and frees him, without the full violence still waiting ahead. Then comes the second decision, the one that turns relief into international trouble. Elated, some of the men decide to go after Tyler. At Ray's neighborhood, the confrontation breaks open. Orders, stones, a pistol, a saber. Bernard Young is wounded by a pistol shot. Alexander Ray is wounded in the scalp by a saber. They take the bleeding magistrate into Canaan, Vermont. His wound is dressed. He is released. No grand army crosses a continent. A magistrate bleeds because a debt writ, a false location claim, and two sovereignties shared one set of roads. Both governments, when the incident climbs upward, work to keep it from becoming something larger. Call it what it is, an international incident, a diplomatic crisis, a proof that paper can cut flesh. Do not dress it up as a war that almost was. The truth is sharp enough without the costume. In the aftermath, New Hampshire does what August threatened. From about mid-November 1835 until February 18, 1836, Militia occupies Indian Stream. On April 2, 1836, local citizens approve a resolution affirming New Hampshire's right to unconditional control. The Republic is no longer a debate. It is a memory under occupation, and then under administration. June 1st, 1840. The United States Census still lists the place as Indian Stream. Population, 315. That detail should stop you. The independent government has been dead for years. The occupation has come and gone, and the federal count still speaks the old name, as if the country leaves a ghost in the paperwork. Later that year, in the New Hampshire legislature's 1840 session, the town of Pittsburg is incorporated, folding the former republic into ordinary municipal life. Then, on August 9, 1842, the international book finally closes. In Washington, Daniel Webster and Lord Ashburton sign the treaty that settles multiple northeastern boundary wounds. The Indian Stream area is assigned to the United States. The relevant line is fixed in the spirit of the American claim, essentially along Hall's Stream. If you have heard that they signed it on a bridge in Pittsburg, set that aside. The treaty belongs to diplomacy at the capital, not to local legends' need for a perfect stage picture. What matters is the sequence. First, the people invent a country because the map is unclear. Then the state ends the country. Then the town is born. Then the international border is finished. The neat line you can drive toward today is not the beginning of the story. It is the edit. And that edit runs through the spine of New England itself, because the Connecticut River is not a northern curiosity. It is one of the great organizing waters of this region, the valley that carried settlement, trade, memory, and conflict for centuries. Its headwaters are where this forgotten republic stood. The people who wrote that temporary constitution were practicing something deeply familiar to New England: town meeting habits under pressure. Law as a tool ordinary citizens reach for when distant power fails them. You do not have to live in Pittsburgh for this to belong to you. If you live anywhere in this region, on the south coast, in Rhode Island, along any stretch of land that still tells itself the revolution finished cleanly in 1783. This is part of the unfinished map of New England. A few hundred people at the top of the river had to invent a country because peace was written without precision, and then the precision arrived without bringing their memory with it. This is not someone else's trivia. This is what our region looks like when you stop accepting the border as inevitable scenery. The Constitution still exists. It survives in Indian Stream Records, Book C, held by the New Hampshire Historical Society, with the enactments and citizens' materials of a government most New Englanders never meet in school. There is a state marker on the green. There is a modern cross-border interpretive circuit, bilingual panels, local descendants who still know the names. On the Canadian side, memory often stresses migration, kinship, a porous border, land lost when lines hardened. On the American side, memory often stresses independence, frontier self-rule, the stubbornness of a small republic. Both can be true to the lived borderland without turning either into propaganda. What is harder to escape is this: most people still do not know. Not because the evidence is missing, because once a map is finished, history prefers the comfort of the line to the inconvenience of the people who had to live in the smudge. The Republic of Indian Stream was never supposed to exist. It existed because an unfinished sentence in a peace treaty left ordinary families under two masters. They answered with a temporary constitution, one of the most honest founding documents you will ever encounter, because it admits, in advance, that it should end when the truth of the border is known. New Hampshire ended their independence under threat of force. A stored debt, a false location claim, and a wounded magistrate showed how thin the peace still was. Pittsburg was born. Webster and Ashburton closed the international question, and the country that was never supposed to exist almost completed its final disappearance. Not on a battlefield, but in the quiet amnesia of a region that thought its founding story was already finished. So when you picture that northern road again, the lakes, the border, the marker people drive past, understand what you are looking at. Not a quirky fact. A place where New England had to invent a nation of a few hundred souls because empire would not finish a sentence. And if one unfinished sentence could hide a republic at the head of the Connecticut, what else in the history we treat as settled is only a finished map over an unfinished truth? Thanks for sitting with this one. If you live anywhere in this region, you already know how much history hides in plain sight. We will keep digging.